Hi everyone, this is Alan McKay and welcome to a new video. So we are at video 8 of 10 in the 10-part training series, and we've accomplished a lot in just a little over 2 weeks. So I'm really excited for the last couple of videos as we're really going to nail down the look, the style, everything as we finalize all of our simulations, our effects, and bring all of this together. So one thing I'll quickly mention is the live action series will be closing down shortly, so we've got a little bit of time left, but if you are on the fence about joining, all I can say is if we've managed to do this in 2 weeks, imagine what we can accomplish in an entire year together. Not to mention the live reviews, the community, personal access to me as we go through it, allowing me to critique your work, give you feedback, answer your questions on a regular basis, as well as doing regular career intensives and live demo reel reviews on top of everything else that we're doing. The cool thing is there's a lot of bonuses that I'm about to announce that are going to be really cool. One of those is that if you're enjoying this training and you haven't had enough time to go through it all, the good thing is that you're actually going to get to keep all of this as one of the bonuses in the live action series. So not only keeping all the 10 lessons, but there are some additional ones that are going to be included as well. So if you are joining the live action series, you can relax knowing that you've got all the time in the world to go through this training. And there are some other bonuses that I'll be announcing in the next couple of days. One I'm really excited for, especially right now with everything going on. This is the perfect time to announce that I'm also going to be doing a live workshop, which you'll also get access to the replay of, on how to set up your own home visual effects studio. In other words, how to work from home, either for an employer or to take on multiple jobs to do visual effects from home. Now, my career, I've done this extensively. I worked on Transformers from my own office, Flight. I just finished Vin Diesel's new movie Bloodshot, which was entirely done from home, as well as Game of Thrones and so many other movies, games, including Call of Duty, TV commercials, cinematics, you name it. So one of the bonuses, if you do sign up for the live action series, is getting to be a part of the visual effects home studio workshop, which everyone inside the live action series will receive as one of the bonuses. So this will be exclusive to us. I will have some seats available publicly, but they're going to cost a couple $100 to be a part of that workshop. So again, this is just some of the value that I'm adding on top of everything else. So if you want to be a part of this, make sure to get your spot in the live action series secured at the moment while there's still seats available. That being said, I'm really excited to get into this lesson. We're doing explosions. Let's dive in. Alright, so at this point we've done a lot, and we've cashed out our building, which I think is a really big accomplishment. Because after all the work that we put into this to intelligently set up a workflow that allows us to get all the dynamics, everything working correctly, we've now cashed it all out and we don't need to go into setting up any more dynamic simulation. So we're at a pretty good point here. So this is what we're left with. So we got the railings, the glass, all of that in one cache. The other cache, of course, is our building destruction. So I'm just going to name these really quick. I'm going to call this TFC for Tyflow Cache, and then we'll call this secondaries, and then we'll hide it because that's the secondaries, the glass and the railings. TFC underscore building would be our main building. So we've got them named, and I'm actually going to select both of these, create a new group, and we'll call this renderable, or render, whatever you want to call it. But this would be where all of our final stuff ends up. So we can hand it over to lighting to light the shot and render it all out if this was in production. So this is looking really cool. Now, the next step is that I want to start creating big explosions everywhere. And this is going to be a lot of fun. And the way that we'll do this, to keep things simple, because Tyflow is still in beta currently, and because that is not 100% integrated with everything else, you can use Tyflow now to emit particles into Phoenix. So we can do that, and we will be doing that for the dust. But I want to keep the explosion stuff relatively simple. So I'm actually going to use particle flow just for the sake of speed. So I'm just going to make this active. I'm going to click a new layer. We'll call this explosions. And the reason is I just want to keep it all neat in here. We probably could have organized all this into subcategories too, but that's fine. So I've got two maxes open. I guess they're trying to autosave over each other at the same time. Okay, so what I'm going to do is let's jump to the front viewport. I'm going to create a flat plane. And I'm just doing that so that way we have something to work from here. And in terms of, I think the first thing to do is to figure out like when this actually happens and how big the initial explosion is. Because already, you know, I'm making stuff too big because we're looking at what the second explosion does, which blows everything up. So I think let's make this like 300 by 300, something like that. And we can move this more to the front. And this is going to be our entry explosion. It's going to happen when the ship first impacts. We're going to explode out that hole. So having our emitter there is good. And I'm just going to hit 6 on my keyboard, which will bring up particle flow. And, you know, tide flow and particle flow are very similar, especially workflow wise. In fact, they're extremely similar in terms of the basic workflow. So I'm just doing this purely because it's fast and simple, so it'll work for what we're doing. Now, I'm just trying to find my object. Okay, so I'm just going to create a new empty flow. Just right click, new empty flow. By default, if we click on the PF source, by default, it always defaults to 50% of the particles in the viewport. So I'm going to make that 100. I'm going to create a berth. I'm doing this kind of quick, but I'm hoping you can keep up here. I'm just doing some basic stuff. So I just added in a berth, position, speed by surface. So the berth, let's make this emit at, I don't know, like 105 to 107. And we can emit like a total of 50 particles, something like that. Now, the main thing is the position. I'm going to add this object. Now I'm going to hold shift and clone the second object here. So I'm just going to hide my building for a second, just so I can see this. And we'll hide the ship as well. So this second object, I'm going to scale up a little bit. And this is purely going to be used to control the direction. So I'm going to click on speed by surface and add that in. And I'm just going to throw some numbers in. We'll just give it like 1,000 and we'll vary that by like, let's say 250. Give it 35 divergence. All I'm doing is just getting a really basic thing. So let's just link these together so that way now the particle system has some information. It has berth, position, speed. So we're just getting some particles to shoot out like that. It's nothing special, but it's something for us to work with. Now the next step will be to create a Phoenix grid. So let's go, I'm going to top viewport, I'm just going to go to Phoenix fire smoke, and I'll just drag this out like so. We can play with it later on. I just want to get the basics happening here. And same thing, just line it up in the viewport so the particles are inside of it. Now, in the modify panel, 2 things just to do right away. Let's get the resolution. We'll start at 20 for the cell size, and then the output, let's just specify an output path, just so that way we can start simulating and just seeing what's happening. So I think it's just good to save this out. So I just specified a path there. Old cache, let me just delete that. Okay, now next thing we need to do is emit from the particles. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the create panel, helpers, Phoenix. You can do all that up here. It's just I want you to get familiar with emitting and reading all your stuff in here. So I just want to drop in a Phoenix source, and I drop in 2. Okay, so in a moment we're going to emit the particles, but I also want to emit from the ship as well. So I think it might be worth doing the ship first, just because that's a constant object. So going back to our ship asset, let's bring that in. We'll go to the modify panel, and I think it's important right away just again to turn this off and say include list, so that way, you know, we're not colliding with these objects or anything else. So I'm just going to add in this guy first, and this one will be our ship. So proxy ship. So add that. So I'm just unhit it. So in the case that it's saying, hey, this has already been used in the scene for our smoke, we can just get this, right click, clone, copy, and we'll just call this explode emitter, and then drag this into our explosions. Now, we'll add the ship in, okay? And finally, going back to our grid, we can just add in the ship itself in there as well. So both of those are in there. Now, going up to simulation, we'll change timeline, turn that off, and we'll set this to 104. So it's basically the frame before it starts emitting particles. And in fact, we'll go a little bit earlier. Let's say 100, just so we got a bit of leeway here, because I might get the ship to kind of catch on fire a few frames early. But having that set up, we'll go to our emitter. Let's move it here, so it's, you know, just remember it's this one. And so what we'll do is we'll just set things up where we're going to animate a few things on and off. We don't need smoke, because we'll have the fuel create smoke. We do need fuel. Let's set our outgoing velocity to be 25, so that way it's a little bit more explosive overall. And I think the main thing would be just to make sure we got motion inheritance. Oh, that's good. All right, so I'm just going to animate some of these values. So let's just say that at frame 103, I just want to have the temperature and the fuel set at 0. So we'll set these both to 0. I'm going to turn auto key on and just press 0 on both of these to set a key. You can see it turns red. Now remember, in Max, when you turn auto key on and we set a key here, it's going to set one at frame 0. So we need to delete that later on, just to remember that that's the case. Okay, so let's just say frame 105, which was the impact frame we wanted. We set this to 2, and this to like, I don't know, 1800, 2000, something like that. And then we'll have this die down by 109, I guess, like around there. We can just animate that back down. Now, let's just go back to frame 0 and delete that one frame that gets created. Because otherwise, at least with the curve that I'm using, they get very warpy. So that's one thing that's probably worth bringing up is in effects, usually you don't want to use, like, these are the default curves that when you install Max it uses. Ever since Max 5 these were introduced. These are just the standard Bezier curves, and these are really good if you're just setting 2 keys. Just as an example, if I set a key here and a key here, we just get a straight line. If I set another one, you see how it warps everything, and that's what we don't want. So it is better, however, than using these guys, which just 2 keys. It creates like a really warpy curve. So just be aware that under Customize Preferences, Animation, Set Defaults, Bezier, you can hold this down and choose the top one rather than this guy, and that way whenever you load Max it's going to default to those curves, and they're just a lot better when you're setting 2 or 3 keyframes. That way you don't need to go back and adjust everything all the time. So I think it's just worthwhile mentioning that, because typically in effects we are setting keyframes, but it's usually 2 or 3. The other curve type is really good for character animation because you're not getting that warpiness, you're getting tangent, so you can control the ease on the curves. But in general, for what we're doing, it's a bit more problematic. So I'm just deleting all these keys because we just want these keys here. Okay, so we're good now. So we just have that spike from 103 to 109. It spikes up and spikes down on the temperature and the fuel. So we could run this, but there's a couple of adjustments I just want to quickly do. The main thing would just be to do with the fuel and dynamics. So main thing is with fuel, we want to enable burning. Okay, and from here, let's just run a sim. We'll see what we get, and we can start tweaking it from there. But this is just the ship coming in, so we can see now we're getting some kind of effect, which is cool to begin with, and it's very explosive. And this is going to be the more basic explosion, by the way. So we're going to have a hero explosion, which is what we're going to see from here. It's the big one. But this one is more just the entry through the hole as it smashes through the building. So it doesn't need to be crazy in terms of complexity. It's mainly just we want to get that flash of fire, and then we'll be getting the big explosion in a moment. So already that looks kind of cool. So a couple things we can do. We can probably move this in just a little bit, so we got a little bit more room. And oops, I'm trying to scroll up. So just with the grid, we can give it a little bit more height as well. So I don't care about going out of that pocket because we're not really going to see it. Okay, so it's not really that important what it does inside of here, because keep in mind all of this is inside of our building. By the way, when we're viewing the GPU, the OpenGL version, no matter where you are, it's always going to prioritize it in the viewport on top of everything else. So if you ever want to see like how this is interacting, just turn off the GPU viewport, and you can kind of get an idea then of like what's going on. But I don't mind this clipping. We're not really going to see it too much. So yeah, I mean, it's okay that it's doing that a little bit. The main stuff that I want to play with here would be like the vorticity. We could bring this up a little bit overall. And we'll introduce some cooling, which is just going to help the fire kind of die out pretty quick. We can play with the gravity, just increase that a little bit, so that way the smoke tends to be heavier, like falling. And quality, just on the conservation, which is kind of the lingering smoke, we'll just keep this around 80. It just means it's going to put more sampling into allowing the smoke to kind of curl and do its thing, rather than simplifying a lot of that. The one really critical thing is to make sure we're at least sampling twice per frame. So this is auto-saving. I'm just going to wait a second, but we'll set this to 2. And then there's stuff like just smoke surface, things like that, that, again, this is all just playing with the vorticity levels. The main thing, though, I think is more going to be just if we play with the fuel a little bit, we can get some interesting results. So already, I think that this is already in a pretty good place, but we can set the ignition temperature less. Just means it's going to ignite quicker, it's going to live a little bit longer. Energy-wise, we don't need to go crazy on this. I think for now, let's just bring it down to 2. And I don't know, I guess fuel depletion, we can lower that a little bit so the fuel doesn't die out as quick. It'll burn longer. But the main thing is we don't need to create as much smoke. But we can, as we did before, play with the propagation and threshold. So by bringing this up, the fuel won't create as much smoke overall. And the propagation is more the overall explosiveness of the fire. So that is a critical one for what we're doing. So run this again. Let's just see how this changes things. And keep in mind too that right now we're getting this kind of spherical ball, and that's more to do with the fact that it's not colliding with anything right now. So like I said, for me this is more just like an entry into the building to get like a nice kind of explosive effect, but I think it's also important to get some interaction in there too. So thankfully we've actually done all that stuff already, and I think that to get all the interaction, so I think this is where we can start to play around with that. So one thing we can do really quick is get our collisions all working, and so I'm just going to go into TIE cache, drop this in here, make sure our explosion is the active layer, and I just want to bring in the collision cache that we exported a while back, I think video 7. So that was the kind of low res retargeted collision shape. So just make sure we center this to 0. So we can just right click on the move button and just put it to 0, 0, 0, so that way it's in the correct position. Okay, so the whole point of this was that we made a low res piece of geo, so that way we weren't dealing with like a really complex over the top simulation, and this is purely to use as a collision object. Now we can go and add our TIE flow in. Sorry, I'm just trying to see it in here. Where are you? Oh, TIE flow cache, there we go. So I'm just going to rename this to TFC building collision. Done. And before we can actually use this, there's two things we need to do. We need to enable particle interface, important, and we also need to disable the GPU instancing, and that should give stability to our sim. So we've added this into the scene interaction. So what should happen now is as this collides with it, and by the way, we have there's these 2 frames where it pops at the beginning. We could go resolve it, but I think the easiest way is just delete our cache, and we'll set this to start at 104. Okay, so we have this low res cache. So as it punches through, it's going to wrap around the floors and everything else, and this is where a majority of the look is going to come from. Like I said, we just want to get this big flash, but the scene interaction is really what's going to make this interesting. So as the hull begins to carve out, this can expand up through the floors and everything else. So already that's looking pretty cool. Now, going back a little bit, we have this emitting with our, like this is the ship emitting. So we have this other emitter, which is, you know, right now we have it kind of expanding out as it comes in, but I also want it to kind of have some kind of exit trail. So we have this other system. I'm going to pick and add in our particle event 1. I think that's all we need. It can be a bit finicky at times. So I'm going to add in particle event 1. I'm going to add in our emitter. And same deal, we want this to also be animated. But for now, let's just turn fuel and smoke on and bring this up to 20. I don't know, just throwing some values in there. But we just added this, so let's just see if it's working, and then we can animate the values and everything from there. But the whole idea is just that way, as these particles punch out here, they're going to fight against the momentum of the ship. So I'm hoping we can just kind of like force this to shoot out a little bit more. So it's a good starting point. We're getting a little bit of a burst in there. I just wanted to actually play it through a bit more just to see what we get from it. So a couple of things we can do here. Let's just select our grid and see some more detail. So I'm just going to go down to reduction, set that to 0. At least that way, under the preview, we see things a little bit more accurately. So I think the spheres could be bigger. There's a few things there. So what we can do is go back into particle flow, and I'm going to add in a shape. I'm going to make this shape a sphere, and we'll make the sphere like 120, give it some variation. So the whole reason that we're doing that, and also display as geometry, is just so that way we can see these as sizes. And now that we can see that, we can go into our second emitter here. We can actually go down the bottom and we can say to use the sphere size, or is it particle shape? It's been a while since I've done this part, so hopefully it's sphere size. It's one of the two. And we can set the fuel to be a bit more. We can set motion inheritance to be like 5 and this to be 55, something like that. I'm just throwing some stuff in there, but what we'll do next is we'll animate it down. But we kind of also don't have to, just because the particles die out pretty quick. So it just depends on if we need to like get crazy with it. Okay, so obviously that's going a little bit nuts, and I'd say that that's the outgoing velocity. I'm going to try 20. Okay, so I just paused this for a second just to tinker with this. So I'm keeping that 55, but I just made the size 50. And I think that's all we really need. However, with the particles, I will make them punch out a little bit more, because we're kind of fighting against this high velocity coming in. So going back into particle flow, as these shoot out, they kind of live forever right now. So what we can do is set this to only live for like 3 and 3 frames. And that way they're going to shoot out very quick. But we'll set the speed a lot higher. We'll set the amount a lot higher. So I just set this to 100 particles and 1500 speed. And that way we're getting this huge punch out. I'm going to vary these just so they're a bit more spread apart. So let's say 800 and divergence. Okay, so hopefully that gives us something kind of interesting. I'm going to run this again. So it's just about, whoops, that happened off screen. I just unhid this for a second just so I could see the particles. So that's the main thing, is just we want to try and get like a really good punchy effect that only lasts for 3 or 4 frames. And it's more just to kind of help give there some kind of exit to what's happening. Because right now the ship comes in and then it's instantly inside, and then we get that second explosion. So I just want something interacting with this to make this a little bit more interesting. So I think that looks pretty cool already. And looking at this from the camera view, that's the sort of thing that we're going to get. So I think that is exactly the kind of look that we're going for, is just to get something pretty interesting overall. Now, at this point, like I said, this is more of a throwaway effect. Like, I want to get a cool explosion, but I also then want to do a second explosion, which will be much bigger. So I think that we've got this part nailed, and it's just more about us creating another one that shoots out the side, which will be much, much bigger. And then we can play with the dimensions and everything else. If we want to, we can change the display back to sorry, I'm totally spacing out today. I cannot see anything. There we go. Turn on GPU. And that way we can see all of this. Now, one thing I will mention is that the buoyancy is really important to kind of get this to rise up, but having it rise up so much makes it feel a little small in scale. So there's a few things we can do. We could set the fuel buoyancy to be negative, which always helps. There's a couple of things in here we could dial in. So negative smoke, negative fuel, and then more gravity. Let's try that. So I just tried pausing this for a second, setting the buoyancy stronger for the smoke, and then the fuel I just kept at 0. I think that overall that just kind of works better, and that's what we get. So this is looking pretty cool. There's definitely things we can do, such as adding drag, stuff like that to kind of help it settle down. For now though, I just want to focus on the second explosion and getting that nailed, but this looks pretty cool. Okay, so let's focus on the next explosion. So we've already laid the groundwork here where we can pretty much just duplicate what we have. So I can just copy, paste here, and hide our tie flow cache. Rotate this 90 degrees. Move it over here. Turn tie flow cache back on and hide our grid just so we can see this properly. So we want the second explosion to be, I'd say like 109, roughly around there. So let's just move these into place. Actually, I think that's not a bad position, about there. Move it inside more because we can have it blast outward. So I think that's good. And then in here, just want to do position, remove this one, add the new one, same thing, speed by surface, add this one. So what we can do here is change the timing. So what do we want? We want like 108 or something. I think like 113, I think is probably a good one. 113, 116, so a little bit longer. I also think this could spread a little bit more. And let's try to make this go out a little bit further too. So I'm just throwing in numbers. You know, I'd rather you not focus so much on, oh, you put in that exact number, and focus more on, okay, like I'm raising these numbers up, so that way I want it to punch forward more. That's what I'm really trying to get, is these particles to push out of the explosion as much as possible. So I think that's a good base to have. And potentially we could create a few more, like if we really wanted to. But with that, I'm going to this emitter, I'm going to clone that emitter, move it slightly, and I'm going to add in event 2. And then, yeah, these aren't animated, so we're good. Alright, so I'm just going to get my grid. Scene interaction, add the emitter, and add event 2. And let's just run a sim and see what we get. A couple of things I'm going to do, because I want this to grow, so I guess like key things to think about, all of these are good. I think with this we can make this adapt to smoke. For now, smoke. And then we'll set a maximum range. And this just means that the grid can expand as much as it wants within reason. And, you know, usually we don't care about what it's doing behind. In fact, we could actually move this back a bit. Like, I don't care so much about behind because we're going to be looking at this angle. But it's more about just making sure that it's got enough room in all the other angles. So the initial grid size is this big. We set it based on the smoke. It's going to, we could give it a little bit of a margin, let's say 10. But it's going to grow outward and it'll have 10 extra units to kind of anticipate its growth in case it's expanding really quick. But it cuts off here. It will not grow any bigger than that. It's really funny. Blur Studio, I was creating a lot of assets, helping build like an asset library, and I was doing these long sims that would go for like a couple of minutes of smoke billowing or something like that. And if you didn't have something like this set up, what would happen is you come in the next day and your sim's still going because the smoke grew like a mile long and suddenly the grid is a mile big. And so having kind of constraints within reason really helps. Okay, so I'm going to run a sim of this and we can just have a look at it all in context and get a better idea. Okay, so I think this is already starting to look pretty cool. I'll play it back twice. First time with the GPU turned on, so obviously it's going to sit over everything, but then once where we can actually see it all in context, so I think a lot of the smoke is going to be inside of it. But obviously it's pretty intense. But I really like the splashing it does up on the wall. It's really cool. And again, detail reduction to 0. And turn the tie flow cache off. Turn the building cache on. So you can see how different it looks when we can actually see it in context of like how it's interacting with everything. So I'm turning auto reduction off just so I can keep it slow and clunky, but at least this way it looks really cool. So I think this is great. I'm happy with how this turned out. There's definitely a few things we could tweak. Like it goes through the ceiling, which kind of doesn't look good, but I don't think it's too big a deal. And like I was saying this earlier, that like a lot of what we're going to be simulating, we won't really get to see, but a lot of it is driving the effect that we get. The only thing that I think could be changed is the second explosion happens a little bit late. So we have the debris all shoot out. Actually, you know what? I think that's fine. I think it actually worked out alright. So I think that's looking cool. At this point, it's more about just how big you want the grid to be. If you want to kind of keep it more contained, then it's more a matter of perhaps adding in drag or getting everything to cool down at least, so that way there's not really much fuel left. Because it's basically around this area, but it's still expanding out a little bit. And like I said, we're going to be adding dust and everything in here, so the grid obviously is hitting the wall at this point. But you can see like that's a lot of range for it to do. If we jump to the camera, we can see this in context, and I think with the dust falling and everything, we're just going to end up with like a massive explosion, and that's okay. But it just really comes down to how far, how big you want everything to be. But I don't really think it's going to expand too much more than that. I haven't simmed all the way through, but I think that is mostly the extent of how big it would get. But we can still constrain it a lot more if we want to. But overall, as it comes in, this is what we're seeing. And then we obviously have the ship on fire as it comes in too. So I think that's going to look really cool. We won't do the rendering and shading yet, I don't think, but overall, when you do run your simulation, enable velocity, so that way we can have motion blur and everything else. It's good to do that last, just because it's going to make the files much bigger. But volume-wise, we're just going to work with fuel temperature, what am I saying? We're just going to be working with temperature, but we're going to set up the shaders, we're going to set this up too. So there's not too much really to do at this point. It's just more about setting up the shader to look really interesting. But yeah, I like how this turned out. So for me, I might make my grid slightly bigger, or I should say just with the extension on it, but that's about all I will do. I think we're good at this point, so expand this a little bit more that way, a little bit more down, definitely a lot more forwards, not so much in this direction. So I think that's a good baseline. I'm going to run my final sim, but I'd say at this point, like, we've seen how this looks, so I want to kind of continue to move forward with everything else, but you know, when we get to doing the shading and everything, we can kind of really dial this in. But I like how this turned out. I think this is going to look really, really epic. So I thought I'd just quickly mention this just for anyone who wants to get ahead between now and the next lesson. So one thing that I intend to do in the next lesson is I'm actually going to be slowing the simulation down. And that's intentional to kind of more emphasize the scale and just to kind of have more screen time. So that's part of this, and the key thing is to make sure that when you do your final simulation, just to output velocity. And the reason for that is that then we can enable the resimulation here, keep the resolution at 0, enable blending for slowdown, and the final thing would be just under input. Where are we? Input. We would just put the play speed at either 0.3 or 0.5. 0.5 would be half the time. And the other thing is our simulation time is 104, so we'd want to put 104 in here. So those would be the steps. I'm going to get into more detail in the next lesson about this. We'll be doing the dust, but probably at the end of that lesson. And it's not too important, but the main thing I just want to mention is just, you know, I already mentioned it for motion blur and everything, but make sure with your final sim to output the velocity. If you don't do that, then everything else won't work. So that's the really critical thing here to keep in mind. Okay, so I just want to quickly mention that. So as I'm recording this, I'm actually at home, just playing it safe at the moment. And so if you hear any weird noises, I've got a cat at home looking out the window trying to chat to birds. So I just figured I'd mention that in case there's any weird noises. Okay, so those are the key steps. I just wanted to mention that ahead of time. I'll walk through it later, but just so that way you don't do your final sim and then you're like, oh, what do you mean, like, I didn't output velocity? Even though I have mentioned it before, you need it for motion blur. But just keep that in mind. Okay, so I'll see you in the next video. We're almost there. We're going to be doing all the big, heavy pyroclastic dust, and it's going to be a lot of fun. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this lesson. Plenty more to come. As I mentioned, make sure to retime your explosion if you want to start playing with that. Otherwise, we'll be going through it in the coming videos. We have 2 more lessons left in this 10-part training series. Like I said, if you're going through this too quickly and you want to make sure that you have this, because again, all of this training goes offline and goes back in the vault March 27. So none of these videos will be available after that. And that's my way of encouraging you to take advantage of this training while you can. But if you want to continue going through this training and you don't want to lose it all, this will be one of the bonuses in the live action series, as well as I mentioned, the home visual effects studio workshop that I'm going to be putting together as a bonus to teach you how to get clients, how to work from home, how to set yourself up and be able to do visual effects from home. So that's going to be completely free as a bonus for everyone inside the live action series, which I think is really critical right now. And the workshop will be available to buy down the line, but it's going to be several $100s. But like I said, completely free as one of the bonuses. I'll be announcing some other bonuses soon, but there's lots to come. We still have some positions available in the mentorship if you want to be a part of it. So I'm really excited for the next 2 videos, and I'm more excited for us to get started on April 6th in the live action series. This is going to be one epic year. Okay, I'm working on the next video. It'll be out shortly. Keep an eye on your inbox. Some really great announcements coming up, as well as video 9. Okay, keep an eye on your inbox, and I'll see you in the next lesson.